We need more strength, more action, not words.
But true action comes from a moral compass, not just power.
Welcome to Curious and Unqualified, a podcast about life in academia. I'm Eric Edlund, professor of physics.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Jimenez. You might recognize me from such departments as the Foundations in Social Advocacy.
So this is our Halloween special, and for this edition we thought we would do something a little different, and something a little fun, and try to inject a little bit of levity into the otherwise serious discussions of higher ed. And so we're going to play a little game today called Heroes and Villains, and we're going to take a side on various characters or ideas in popular culture and argue it out.
Yeah, originally we were looking at more serious assessments of heroes and villains, and then we thought we'd sort of like start off talking about real people, but then sort of verge to the fictional realm and the theoretical realm.
So, round one, we have Greta Thunberg versus Elon Musk.
Shame! Destroy the virus!
So I decided to first focus my hero as being Greta Thunberg from Sverige. Interesting, my history with Greta, I don't know her personally, but when I was like doing my climate change deep dive, like 2019 or so, I was just basically putting climate change in YouTube and see what came up. And one random video I saw was had something like 30 subscribers, like maybe like 50, 60 views, was this young girl sitting on the sidewalk protesting for the climate change. And I actually left a comment. I think either the first or the only comment on the video. And later on, of course, turns out she became this major sensation. And so it's just kind of interesting that I found her, and it's not like I promoted her. I just think I might have just liked the video. And yeah.
Who knows what would have happened without your encouragement?
Exactly. With that one comment could have been the tipping point, the positive tipping point. But yeah, so for this show, we're going to basically, each one of us is going to share a couple of points as to why the person we're discussing might deserve hero status. And then we'll have a conversation in response to that. So I will lead off. Oh, sorry. Say something.
Well, I was just going to say it, as this is a comedic venture of a sort, I think we should encourage our listeners to not maybe take everything we say so seriously, and that, perhaps some of what we say expresses our own belief, and part of it also might be embellished and hyperbolic.
Yes, so we leave the viewers to determine what you think are our real views, or just what are reasonable views or not. And we're also doing this in part because we've often found that sometimes academia gets a reputation for being a joyless place. And so another reason why we wanted to at least, put some humor into these conversations.
All right. Why don't you kick us off with your thoughts on Greta Thunberg?
All right. So we're just going to come up with 3 points in favor of our chosen character. And I will say for Greta Thunberg, the first point is she inspired a worldwide youth movement to pressure their governments to do something about climate change. Very forceful. She took controversial stands by missing school. And basically, and I did research in Singapore, and I spoke to a lot of people there, but of course, not just for my research. A lot of people know that she has inspired a lot of people. And to be fair, of course, she is a white activist from a relatively privileged country. She herself is fairly privileged within her own society as far as her parents' background. I would want to acknowledge that there's plenty of environmental advocates who don't get that level of attention and just sacrifice just as much. And perhaps put themselves in much more danger, especially when they're activists in sub-Saharan Africa and South America. But nonetheless, she has been pivotal in that sense. Okay. Another point is that she's willing to personally suffer to fight for her values. 2 notable trips, the one where she took a boat across the Atlantic. I forgot to attend either a UN meeting, I think, here. And so she didn't just take the simple way to fly. She did the more arduous journey. And then more recently, as part of the Gaza flotilla, to deliver aid to the people in Gaza who were being prevented from receiving their aid by the government. And so she put herself on the line, and, she experienced probably nothing comparable. And by her own words, she admits it's not the same abuse that many Palestinians have received in custody. But nonetheless, she experienced that hardship. She's willing to feel it herself. And lastly, she role models her advocacy. So she is a vegan, and one of the key components to addressing climate change is to reduce meat consumption. And so she's, is willing to, despite, cheese, dairy being a big part of, and Swedish meatballs part of her culture, she's gone full vegan as a way to kind of live her values. So that's my case for why Greta deserves the hero label.
Let me ask you a few questions about Greta here and your thoughts on her. First off, well, I want to start with an acknowledgement of all that you said there. I think the second point most resonated with me. I remember years ago reading about her taking a sailboat, I think it was, from Sweden over, I think it was to a UN conference in the United States, right? And I was impressed by that, that she would put herself out at sea for, I think it was 1 or 2 weeks in pretty harsh conditions. And I thought that was admirable. An interesting message to send to people. How much impact it had, I don't know. And so let me ask you about that aspect of her activity. What would you say has been the net impact of Greta Thunberg on the world? How much has she moved the needle?
That's a very fair point. To what extent do we evaluate heroics based on the intention and the effort, and to what extent do we rely on the outcomes? And if the point of her actions was to have us collectively address climate change, I would say it's fair to say it's been a failure. Of course, I think the problem is so monstrous, no one activist anywhere could not only not solve it, but could even probably move the needle at all when all the forces of industrial modernity are pushing us towards more warming. So it was probably too Herculean a task to actually take on. But I would admit, if she was hoping her advocacy might have moved the needle, probably not, except for the fact that maybe some of the people she motivated, if they've adopted other environmental lifestyles, not just related to climate change, but, maybe more composting, maybe more vegan eating. I think there's other benefits that could come if people got into the environmental movement as a result of her, even if the main goal of checking carbon emissions has not been successful.
It's an interesting question, right? Like exactly what you raised earlier. How much of our assessment of whether someone is a hero depends upon the outcome. And you can put a whole lot of effort into meaningless things. And at the end of the day, what do you make of that, right? And if you were to take the position that trying to divert the world's course from the path that we're currently on is essentially a fool's errand because the forces are too great to do anything about it, then do you give someone hero status for embarking on a fool's errand? I don't know the answer to that. My expectation, in kind of sense, is that there's part of that that's admirable, but also there's part of that seems kind of foolish and naive. So I guess that would be my main criticism of Greta Thunberg, is that I just don't see anything. I mean, in likewise with the flotilla going to Gaza, they knew that wasn't going to succeed, right? There's an Israeli embargo on Gaza. So what was the point? It got a few headlines. And, there's some images of her getting arrested on the boat, and maybe that was useful, but I'm pretty skeptical that had much value in the end.
I guess the thing I would say to that, if one engages in actions more for other personal reasons, such as attention or self-aggrandizement, knowing that it's not going to be successful, then that would seem to not be worthy of the hero cause. So, but it's possible either she did believe, and many did believe, her actions could have impacts, or you do what's right because it's right? And I think, as me being on the doomer end of the environmental spectrum, a lot of what I do, positive environmental actions, I know the trajectory is fairly futile. Nonetheless, I rewild my lawn because it's the right thing to do. Me providing more pollinator habitat will not reverse the sixth mass extinction, but it's the right thing to do, and there in itself, not calling myself a hero, but you do the right thing for that sake. And in that case, she was doing the right thing by raising awareness of these issues, even if deep down she sensed it might be futile.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, and it has to me a sense. I hope I don't offend anyone by this, because I really don't mean this in any offensive way. But it has kind of a sense of religiosity to it, right? Is that you're doing things out of kind of an inherent internal, I don't satisfaction maybe isn't the right word, but kind of a sense of justice, right? Or that this is like the moral path that you want to be on, regardless of the outcome. That being said, if you believe that that we're on the wrong path, it would be interesting to try to have actions that would actually lead towards a substantially different outcome. One of my other main criticisms of Greta Thunberg is that, I don't see that she's actually moved the needle at all. But then, you can take the stance that it's just the morally right position to be in, regardless of whether there's a change. My bigger criticism, though, is that I don't recall her ever advocating for something different. There's all this sense of like panic and the house is burning and we need to do something. But just saying that we need to do something, to me, is not sufficient. Like, if you're going to say that, you need to advance an alternative. And so my question would be like, what is the alternative worldview that Greta Thunberg is advancing? And it could be that it exists and I just don't know. So maybe you can fill in the gap here if you know more about this.
I don't know more about that. I don't think she's offered a concrete alternative to a fossil-fueled world. I would also give her a little leeway as a 15-year-old, at least initially a 15-year-old advocate, to not have it fully thought that out, when a lot of course, professors and other people who write about this also will say things like we need to get off fossil fuels without actually spelling what that means. I think a lot of people aren't being honest that when you get rid of fossil fuels, there's a lot of hardship that comes with that. And so, yeah, I think there is no easy alternative world that can be spelled out, and that's why many people probably avoid it. But in her case, giving her youth, that I would give her more of a pass for not being able to spell that out explicitly compared to a lot of other older professionals who study and have degrees in this field.
I see that, and at the same time, I think we have to recognize her youth, and that she was certainly not as experienced and maybe aware of the complexity of the world. But we shouldn't be just praising someone because they're young and being an advocate. I think we should be praising people because they are clearly defining a problem with a solution.
Well, maybe she was sort of just advancing her argument, not in words, but by actions. By striking school, she might have been sending the message, schooling is very much invested in the world of industrial modernity. And so by refusing to participate, I am suggesting we all pull out of schools to contribute to this harmful practice of education as it appears so much in modern systems. But the other point I would grant is that as far as the effectiveness, yes, to reiterate, there's not that evidence of effectiveness, although the timing is very interesting because the youth climate movements kind of had their peak in December 2019, January 2020. And what happened within a few weeks? COVID took over the world, right? So there was this huge momentum towards environmental activism that COVID basically shut down. And of course, here enter the conspiracy theorists that COVID was unleashed because they were concerned about all the people motivated with climate change. Not advancing that, but simply say we really don't know what could have happened because the timing turned out to be pretty terrible. In fact, I was going to do a follow-up to my research in Singapore, and then COVID hit and I couldn't. It actually worked out for the publishing of the paper because they asked how come you haven't done a follow-up study? I was like, well, I would have liked to, but COVID, everything got shut down. So we actually can't know what might have been the effect if COVID never. Fair point.
Maybe her activity got interrupted by those world events. I want to share one little story that I think kind of captures my views on her or this kind of praise of the youth movement. It was, I don't know, probably 5 years ago, pre-COVID, maybe I think just shortly pre-COVID, when I and a few other folks went over to see a play of yours in Ithaca.
Ah, yes.
You remember this?
I do, yes. The Next Storm, Cornell.
I forgot the name of it. Yeah, anyway. At the very end, there was this kind of call, I guess a call to action of a sort where all of the actors on stage basically asked everyone in the audience to rise up and give their power and support to the next generation of activists to solve the problems that our generation couldn't. And I was the only one who sat in the audience. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to give up authority to a bunch of naive 15-year-olds. That's just not, there's no world in which that makes sense to me. I'm sorry. That probably was kind of an early warning sign of my leanings that were not totally that I wasn't totally on board with the left way of thinking about things.
Well, I did not realize that you did that, Stan, but I actually appreciate anyone who goes against the grain, right? I mean, the counter would be that famous picture of the Nazi rally where it was the guy who like refuses to raise his head, right? So like,
I mean, I felt compelled at that moment to stand, and I'm like, no, I'm going to be the asshole who's going to sit in this moment, and everyone's going to look at me like, well, why the hell?
I think bucking the collective trends, there's always value to that. But what's interesting you mentioned that is because we actually. So the play was this kind of collaborative developed thing. Like we had a script writer, but we also gave all this input and we did all these like breakaway sessions, and the ending we revised so many times. Like, so it's just funny that like that stuck with you because that was like, I don't know, like the 6th or 7th version of the ending that was completely different from the previous version. So yeah, we did struggle to find a way to end that everyone would be on board.
And let me be clear. You mentioned earlier how, there's plenty of professors who are also advocating for things, very similar to what Greta advocates for, right? Kind of a movement away from fossil fuel usage. And I would hold them to the same, give them the same criticism that I'm giving to.
But I would say even more of a criticism.
More so, right? But and I think this is my problem with the environmental movement at large is that it doesn't. I don't think it's lacking a key component, which is it's not sufficient to advocate against something. You have to advocate for something as its replacement. And I see Greta Thunberg as very much a person who's against without an argument for.
Okay. Yeah, and I would say that is a fair criticism, right? That it's much harder to imagine the world, especially because modernity is completely dependent on fossil fuels for every aspect of its existence. So yeah, I would say that that's a fair critique. But talking about the environment, I believe the person you're going to raise is also once considered a darling of the environmental movement. It seems to have fallen at least a little bit from there. And so why don't you?
So Elon Musk. I'm going to focus for this argument on kind of his, what I'd say, 3 main financial commercial endeavors. So the big one up front, kind of early on, was Tesla. And you can give him all sorts of criticism. He wasn't, the founder of, or one of the founders of Tesla. But he did play a critical role, and I think this part is misunderstood, is that Tesla was essentially on the edge of bankruptcy, right? They were down to having just days of cash left, right? And it was at that time when Elon Musk came in with his, hundreds of millions or billions that he had in pocket at that point, and essentially bailed out the company and pushed it through and got their products to a place of being marketable and made the company profitable. So I think he did play a pivotal role in bringing this technology to fruition. And you have to acknowledge that Tesla, whether or not you like Elon Musk, and you can criticize the electric vehicle technology as well, but Tesla has been extremely instrumental in advancing this technology into the public market, right? And I think it's maybe reasonable to assume that if Tesla hadn't done it, we might be many years behind where we are right now in terms of electric vehicle pickup. Now, so that's Tesla. Second, SpaceX. SpaceX, absolutely revolutionary company, and over the course of time has brought down immensely the cost of orbital payload transport. And I think another aspect of this aspect of his work that we need to keep in mind is that his original mission with getting involved in launching SpaceX was really I think in this sense, very much aligned with Greta Thunberg, right? He is concerned about the survival of humanity, right? And it takes a very different approach than Greta Thunberg. Like, he is a person who's not advocating, recognizes that there's a problem, but is advocating and trying to advance a solution, right? And his solution, like it or not, believe it or not, is to try to get us to the point where we have the capability of inhabiting another world, right? Kind of a plan B. So lots to discuss there. And then as a third point, I think we can look at some of his other ventures that he's involved in. And I'd like to pick up the Neuralink endeavor, right? Which is this technology company, and I'll admit that I know very little about this, but it's this company that's looking at developing brain implants that can do all sorts of remarkable things, right? Maybe these could be like cognitive enhancements, but they're often used or advocated as a way to help people overcome disability or paralysis, right? And so there's a real humanitarian mission behind this. And I think in this aspect, you can see that he's got, a sense of looking out for the goodwill of people who are in some way suffering.
Okay, so, and I think you had the harder task of finding maybe tough criticisms for Greta, and I might have the harder task of finding reasonable things to say about Elon. But in the spirit, I will try my best. Well, first I'll grant Tesla's a pretty sweet ride. Shout out to Smitty, who got me to ride my first Tesla. It's a nice car. You say it's profitable, but I'm not sure how profitable without a ton of government subsidies, right? He was heavily dependent on government subsidies to make it profitable, but still, I'll grant he played a role in reviving it. Although more recently, he's also caused the stock to plummet and caused the company to plummet because of his recent antics, many deplorable antics. And as far as the electric car being a positive force for the environment, he's kind of, I think, more than offset that by signing up with Team Trump, which is objectively the most disastrous administration towards the environment in American history, like completely dismantling the EPA and anything that has remotely any ties to environment, he's destroying it. So whatever goodwill he got by adding electric cars to the mix, he's doing a lot by teaming up with some bad actors today. But even electric cars, I talked a little bit about this on our interview last week with our guests from Cortland. But electric cars, you still need fossil fuels for every point of the manufacture. You need it for all the mining and the minerals and the transport and the assembly and the manufacturing and et cetera. So it's not like you're really building alternative fossil fuels. You're just kind of adding on electricity to the mix. Okay. The other on SpaceX, I'm a fan of space since the earliest childhood. I love thinking about it, fantasizing about it, but that's really what it is. It's a fantasy. I think there is no reasonable way humans can not even, let alone colonize the galaxy, colonize Mars. And Mars would, of course, be your first outpost. But I think it's really its inability to handle death. Because, yes, the sun will go red giant. And when the sun goes red giant, it will devour the Earth and quite possibly Mars. And if not directly devour it, probably make it very uninhabitable. I think that's just a fate we have to come to terms with, right? Like, just like the people who want to freeze themselves or upload their brain to the consciousness, they can't accept death. I think sort of like trying to colonize the galaxy is just another way of not accepting death. It's a fun exercise to imagine. And I love seeing those new images of Pluto. Those were, you can obtain by a relatively, no human cost, minimal cost of sending out the satellite to get those pictures. It's a very different endeavor to actually colonize space. And of course, I think, I don't know if Elon's directly part of the long-term movement, effective altruism, but I think he's certainly adjacent and has allies in that movement. And that movement's very much about this idea, like, we need to keep humans, flourishing species for as long as possible. But I find it interesting that, like, the movement is concerned about the eventual extinction of humans millions and billions of years in the future, while really ignoring the actual immediate threats now of the sixth mass extinction and collapsing ecosystems worldwide. So there's this like focus on the far distant threat to humanity at the expense of what I think is going to be the much sooner and much more likely potential for extinction are the current ecological threats.
I think Elon Musk actually talks about the more near-term effects as well, right? Is that he's mentioned things to this extent that we are polluting our world and that we need to have a plan B in case we make our world inhospitable. So he thinks about both fronts.
Right, but I think if you ran the numbers, it's a lot easier to keep the Earth habitable than it is to make Mars habitable, right? It's just like the sheer force of what's necessary to get just the radiation of the Martian surface, right? Like, if you actually could make Mars habitable and you could grow food there, right? You're living in bunkers, all right? You're probably not enjoying things like swimming in a lake, right? There's not going to be any lakes on Mars.
Undoubtedly, it's going to be a miserable, dusty, dry experience, right? You're living on a desert world, a sub-zero desert world perpetually. Like, it's going to be a very difficult life. I think in this sense, though, that in this aspect, we're in danger of thinking too small, right? And if you went back 100 years, like, would you imagine that everyone would have a supercomputer in their hands and that they could communicate across the world at light speed with each other? Like, that was the stuff of science fiction, right? Would you imagine that we could actually build detectors that could measure black hole mergers in another galaxy? Like, it was even unfathomable to think of that question 100 years ago, right? And so I think in this regard, maybe Mars is the next baby step, right? And that there's a larger step beyond that to a more habitable place.
I will grant that, yeah, certainly that's the classic examples of like, oh, you ask someone in 1900, they would have imagined people were on Mars, later in the century. However, all of these amazing exploits of humans in modernity are brought to us by a fossil fuel surplus, right? It's a fossil fuel surplus which is currently available, but it's dwindling. And it's environmentally deleterious. So yes, we might be able to do all this stuff with identifying quasars, but the resources necessary to do that are on their way out. I have some friends, for example, who, some people like to talk about fusion, and I have some colleagues that work in fusion, and they sort of tell me that, like, despite what the research might say, is like, it's a very far off, if impossible, technology. So I think we can dream about these technologies and write about them in papers, but in the reality, they're often not very feasible.
And being one of those people that works in the fusion energy world,
I had no idea.
I would say exactly this. I think it is a distant hope that this actually comes to fruition, but I think we also have to work on it, because what other chance do we have, right? You need to take these kind of Hail Mary pursuits, right? To not do that means to just give up.
Give up on
civilization as we know it.
Yes, sure. But that would be my whole point, is the fact that we can't see the writing on the wall to give up civilization as we know it is why we find ourselves plummeting into the sixth mass extinction.
This gets at the division here. I think there are people who are ready and say we should give up on civilization, and there are people who are saying not yet, or I think we don't have to.
Sure.
To your point about the extinction of, our use of fossil fuels, right, and the fact that these are not limited, that is true on Earth. But if we find other worlds that have untapped fossil fuels, we can keep going.
Yeah, how are you getting the fossil fuels to get there? I think, I love the imagination of these exercises when I'm, going for a walk in the cemetery and imagining like what it would look like, but just having looked at the numbers. And I'd like to give a shout out to Professor Tom Murphy, who I've worked with, who has a whole blog about it. And he actually was, I forget specifically, but I think he landed lasers on the moons of Mars. So he's very involved at NASA and all this technology, but he has a blog where he basically runs down the numbers of the feasibility spatial and concludes harshly that this is not something we can actually continue in the decades ahead. Its days are numbered. People can enjoy it while they can, but there's no hope to this as being a...
This just means we should redouble our efforts with getting to space while we can.
Okay. I say this as someone who realizes there's much better resources than space travel and all this investment in SpaceX. I think there's better ways to use our money, but since people are doing it, I'm happy to follow the updates and learn and see those beautiful images of Pluto. So on your last point, though, was about the Neuralink. And I'll say, yeah, it's good that he's investing in this, but I wouldn't say it's exactly heroic. So billionaires that have a lot of money to give around, they should be praised because they give a small portion of their money to good causes. What about all the people who don't have disposable income or who give $100 a month to cancer charity, but that's actually a much larger percentage of their income than Elon? So yes, he's made good investments in positive things, but he gets that attention because he's a billionaire. I don't know if that distracts from other people who would be willing to and who actually do give more percentage of their income to similar causes. And of course, he's not the one doing the research. He's just funding it. It's the scientists that are actually doing the research. And but I will say it was interesting. I had a long conversation with a friend of mine with a disability who, for the longest time, did defend Elon Musk because of Tesla. And he said there's ways in which Elon's products were more mindful of people with disabilities than previously in the auto industry. Eventually, though, for him, the negatives of Elon did outweigh what he had sought to be the positives. And so some of those negatives include, he's not the most positive with race relations, like whether or not you believe he was intentionally giving the Nazi salute. I think he was. Some might differ. There was a $137 million lawsuit by that plaintiff won for creating a racially hostile environment. So there's been a lot of complaints about the workers at his company. I also think, I know you're a father, I am not, but I would assess him as being a pretty terrible father because he seems to be more keen on producing as much offspring as possible and not taking any responsibility for being there as a father and just allowing his billions to kind of like pay off the mothers. Because, if he, by his own admission, it's believed he has many children, probably over a dozen. And
I think he's got 14 children with 21 mothers or something.
Right, yes, and I believe he aspires to more. So not only, of course, is that, I think, as a negligent father, but in the context of an Earth that can't support 8 billion people currently, it's also negligent environmentally. But yeah, and then of course there's, there's actually, you can see a episode I did of my friend Sandy Shellis, has a podcast called Environmental Coffee House. I gave a more at length of my thoughts on Elon, but I'll just also say, like Trump, he's a narcissist, and that gets in the way of a lot of the good works he does. And one of the things I found particularly problematic was when he called that person who had suggested his boats won't be effective at saving those children trapped in the Thai cave a pedo guy, right? So like to basically completely defame someone who was just trying to give an honest assessment at the likely success of this rescue boat, like to, completely turn all his fans against this person. I think that's, a clear abuse of power that would take away any potential at deserving hero status.
Well, you raise a number of good points about the character of Elon Musk here, and I don't think I can in any way defend him against all of these criticisms. I mean, I think he some of these are well deserved. I don't know or forgot about the pedo comment, for example. I think this brings in a larger question though of like, do our heroes need to be perfect, like in the Tolkien sense of the ideal hero, or can they be flawed human beings and still have heroic value or status, right? And if so, if the latter, if we agree that all people are flawed, then I think we can consider Elon Musk as a candidate for hero status.
Well, you are certainly citing the biblical precedent in terms of, I believe, Jacob and Esau, right? There were two brothers. Esau was the one who was supposed to inherit everything, and he was like the hardworking brother, and Jacob was kind of like the mischievous, lazy brother who deceived him out of his birthright by giving him water when he was thirsty, because Esau was working so hard. So I think it's interesting, that there's actually this tradition of like Jacob being actually a scoundrel, but he's actually the founding, considered the father of the nations of Israel, even though he's such a flawed person. So yeah,
interesting. This is beyond my very minimal biblical knowledge, but it sounds like an interesting thing to consider further. I'm just going to try to address quickly a couple of your points here that you raised on the issue of his Roman salute, whatever you want to call it. People say Nazi salute. That's a tough one. To say that is a Nazi salute means that you would have to get inside his head and know what he said, like what he meant. I think you can reasonably guess what people mean sometimes. He did go on record after that saying it was not that. You also have people like Cory Booker essentially doing the same salute at the end of a speech. So, but they're
doing it based on the trajectory of his arm, right? I don't think.
So if what you're talking about is a difference that Elon Musk's arm was 10 degrees higher than Cory Booker's, now we're splitting hairs.
We invite viewers to examine both clips and draw their own conclusions based on what they see.
And that's a fair point. But my point here, though, is that you can reasonably say that Cory Booker was not giving a Nazi salute, right? Maybe based upon some of the other things that Elon Musk has said and done, like maybe you might conclude that he is. To me, I'd say I park that in a gray area where I don't know.
Well, someone whose intentions we might know better might be considered Darth Vader. So
no. I'm not. No. A few more points on so I guess one of the other points you brought up was about how ineffective Tesla is, right? Despite it being an electric vehicle, how ineffective it is at actually, moving the needle on our climate situation. I think that's 100% true. I think electric vehicles are largely a joke. in terms of their effectiveness. I think what they are is, by and large, a way of feeling good about your contribution, giving yourself, a little pat on the back for being a good, a good climate activist or somebody who cares, So really, what it is kind of a way of signaling your belief system in the world, and that's not without value for people that care about such things. So he gave people a very clear way to do that,
and also outsourcing your pollution, because the whole thing is that like the pollution is in the factories, right? You get to charge an electric battery so that you don't actually have to deal with the fumes where you are. So they serve that function of making your own neighborhood cleaner, but it's because the pollution was outsourced elsewhere.
Yeah, and there's an argument behind that's I think a little bit more legitimate, which is that large-scale production of energy can be done more efficiently than small-scale production of energy in an internal combustion engine, right? And so there's some gains to be had there. I agree that I don't think you give someone hero status for being an investor and having billions that they can toss around willy-nilly, right? I see Elon's role in businesses as more than that. I think he actually has a pretty heavy hand in determining the course, and he's actively engaged. I mean, if you want to talk about somebody who works, like, the dude almost doesn't even have a home, I think, from what I understand. Like, he sleeps in his office many nights, and he works ungodly hours each week. And so he's really trying to be involved in these companies and push the technology. Even so far as, like, when SpaceX was getting off the ground, it went through a very uncertain phase where it almost itself went bankrupt. And he, for a while, because it was a new company, he couldn't hire good talent. And so he was working as lead rocket engineer for a time, and fully acknowledged. I thought this was actually an interesting point about Elon Musk. Fully acknowledged that he was not the best person to do this, like recognizing that there is much better talent in the world, but because he couldn't hire that, he had to do it, and got to the point with, not just him, of course, but with him and what team he could assemble at that point, got their first successful launch, and after that was able to start getting funding from NASA.
Are there a shortage of rocket engineers? Is that why it was not?
No, but I mean, think about it. Like, if you are working a very nice salaried, stable job at Boeing or Lockheed or wherever, and here's this startup based out of, where was it, Southern California at that point, by this crazy tech billionaire who thinks he knows how to build a rocket. Like, are you going to give up, move your family, go there, and maybe be out of a job in 6 months? Maybe even take less salary at the beginning? Like, there's a lot of risk in going into startups. So he got some people to come over. But the big talent that was in the field for a long time that really knew how to do this stuff, they weren't coming on board early on.
Well, it also seems there's a lot of risk more recently in his rockets, because I believe there's been more crashes recently than in the initial.
But this is all interesting. Yes, but he is also building. I think his Falcon rockets. Those things are doing fine. They're great. They're reliable vehicles. But when you talk about Starship, this is the biggest rocket ever, right? It's bigger than the Saturn rockets in terms of what it can lift and what it can do. And some of those, they've had misfires and, stuff has exploded. They've also, but like, look, NASA has blown up, rockets like this, 2 space shuttle disasters. Like, it is still the most dangerous industry to go in. Like, astronauts die at a higher rate still than people in the military per capita basis. Like, it's just a risky business. So I think he gets a lot of heat and a lot of flack from people who don't understand what this business is about.
So should we switch over to round 2 at this point?
I think we should. I have one comment to make before we do that, is that I think it's clear who we're advocating for heroes. It's unclear whether we're advocating that the other person's hero is actually a villain. And that's an interesting point.
Yeah. And I think I would be making that case in my case.
The spy. Okay. So you're saying he's a villain. I think I'm going to have to say that Greta Thunberg is villain.
Oh, he's going on record.
I'm going on record as a comedy piece that Greta Thunberg's a villain. I think she I don't think it makes sense to yell fire in a crowded movie theater and not have a solution for how to make the situation better. I think she's causing a lot of panic without solutions.
Okay.
All right, round 2. All right, so we thought round 2 we'd go from the realm of real characters into the realm of fictional characters. In round 2, we have Darth Vader versus Thanos.
How what? I'll leave with Thanos. Okay. So just how it came about that this choice is, going back to my research in Singapore, I was interviewing all these focus groups about thoughts of the environment. And the first focus group, some students shouted out, Thanos was a hero, right? Because we're talking about population. And I was like, what? Thanos is a hero? And the Marvel movie had just come out like very recently, so it was kind of on people's mind. And then so after that shout out comment, I was like, oh, I'm just going to poll all my future focus groups of like, elementary, middle school, teenagers, high school students. What are their thoughts on Thanos? And what was remarkable is that I forgot how many focus groups, maybe like 20 focus groups overall. In every focus group, either a majority or a plurality had said Thanos was a hero. So the choices were hero, villain, or complex, both, in between, etc. So it was always the most popular response. I was like, wow. And I was like, this is fascinating. Then, of course, part of me is like, okay, they're young people. It's a provocative thing to say he was a hero, right? So there might be right. And, of course, as I wrote in my paper, there were population control policies, not only in Singapore, but in the region. So, like, maybe people are more amenable to ideas of population control. But still, I got to really think about it. Like, wow, like, students are really advocating that they think Thanos is a hero for the most part. So I'll take the case of the hero case for Thanos. So if you're not familiar with it, in the movies and in things of Infinity War, Thanos, this is the movie Thanos. It's very different than the comic book Thanos, right? So, but in the movie Thanos, his argument for his seeking of power is because overpopulation is destroying the planet. And so what he as an environmental sustainability measure, he randomly kills off half the population of humans to make the Earth more sustainable. And so I would say in defense of this action, emphasis, comedy episode, he's pursuing a fair allocation method, right? So a lot of economists debate what's the fairest way to make sacrifices and allocate things. Like, often it comes down to random is the fairest way, because every other form of allocation is going to involve some kind of bias, right? So to choose random as a way to do it is, if in fact, and I think it's interesting he chose half, because what we know from, so there's 8 billion people on Earth, and about 4 billion people are dependent on the Haber-Bosch process, the artificial fertilizer creation, that pulls nitrogen into the atmosphere. It's a very disastrous process for carbon emissions. I think it's 1.3% globally. It also on the long-term destroys soil for complex reasons of like disrupting the microbial communities. But anyway, so some estimate that only about 4 billion people on Earth can survive without the industrial fertilizer. And again, it's bad for the environment, and it might eventually we might lose the components for it, right? Like natural gas and coal to actually power the Haber-Bosch process. And of course, what the climate change causes. So it's interesting he chose half, because that basically leads to a population that can survive without the Haber-Bosch process. Okay, point 2, he gives up his power after his goal's achieved, right? So like, in case people were thinking he was doing it really for power, you see pretty clearly that he causes the mass death of half of humanity, but then he goes off and kind of like no longer wants a throne, no longer wants attention. He's just living a life of a simple farmer out in a rural area, right? So he clearly wasn't doing it for narcissism or attention. He thought it was the right thing to do, and then he gave up all the power that the stones had given him. And lastly, he stays true to his principles. So there are a lot of Marvel people were trying to attack him and kill him, and at the end of it, he didn't choose to use the stones to kill off all the Marvel opponents. He put them like all are humans. Half of them died, right? So he didn't have this kind of petty vindictiveness we see so much in our current administration of the person seizing power and using that power to pursue unlawful campaigns against political opponents. He actually was like, no, I'm going to actually allow randomness to determine who lives. And of course, then it ended up killing in the end, because the Marvel stars who were not killed randomly went off and they killed him. So those are 3 cases I will make for why Thanos deserves the hero mantle.
I have lots to say about this here. Maybe I'll start with this, is that I have never watched the Avengers. I actually tried in the last week to watch Avengers.
That's preparation
and study for this show. And by God, those are terrible movies, man. I think if anything, I have to say that the real villains here are the Hollywood screenwriters. Like, I think I made it half an hour into Infinity Wars and an hour into the one after that, and I couldn't do it. That being said, I will grant your point as stated here. On the last one, I'm curious. Do you know this? When he selected half of, or set up the situation in which half the inhabitants of the universe, I guess it was, died, was he included in that pool, or did he exclude himself?
That is a good question. I don't think that is made clear in the episode. I think clearly if he did include himself, that he would deserve more heroic accolades. But yeah, I don't think that was addressed.
I wonder about that. I don't know either. All right, let's go back to the beginning here. So he was doing this out of a sense of necessity, like dark necessity, right? To save and preserve what future there was for humanity, and I guess for other inhabitants.
Other species, yeah.
He decided to kill half of all people. And so then you make an argument that, well, maybe half is a reasonable number based upon this. I think there's a big hole in this argument, which is if we got from 4 billion to 8 billion people, and then he kills us back to 4, what's to stop us from going to 8 billion again?
I think nothing would. I think probably, it's basically, it would require repeated interventions by future Thanos.
To me, this sounds honestly a lot like Greta Thunberg. It's advancing a criticism without a real solution, to be honest. I just don't see that as an effective means. On the other points, I grant you those. I think admirable that he didn't use this for a personal vendetta to take out the Avengers. On whole, I think a few of them died in the process, right? I think that was stated. I got as far as that in the movie. And what was your other point here?
He gives up power afterwards.
Oh, he gives up power. Yeah, I guess that's admirable too. Yeah, so I give him that. I ding him. Yeah, total ineffective strategy. But all right.
So for the record, you find Greta more of a villain than Thanos.
I think they're pretty neck and neck here. I'd have to think about it. It's a close race there.
All right, and so who is your hero that you would like to?
For round 2 is Darth Vader, and I think he is in some sense kind of the iconic villain, at least of the sci-fi world, right? You think about him leading the stormtroopers into battle, oppressing planets, using the Death Star to destroy Alderaan and maybe some other systems, like pretty oppressive, nasty stuff. I think when you look at his character, though, that he's far more complex, and we need to take all of that into consideration, again, when we assess the qualities of whether someone is a hero or villain. And I want to, at first, rewind back to the beginning here. Before Darth Vader was Darth Vader, he was Anakin Skywalker. And interestingly, he talks about himself, like, kind of essentially killing the being that was Anakin Skywalker, right? Like he parted ways at some point with that past. And so there's an interesting discussion here about whether you can associate his actions as Anakin with his actions as Darth Vader. For the moment, I'm going to assume that they are still one person and that we can do that. And so in his role, prior to that, I think we can look to his youth, right? Where he was a very altruistic, self-sacrificing child, right? And he put himself at great risk to help those that we saw in, gosh, what was the name of it? I forget.
Oh, the Phantom Menace.
Phantom Menace. Thank you. Was it Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan? I think we're stuck on Tatooine with him, right? Or I don't even think it was Tatooine. I'm scratching the or hitting the edge of my knowledge. I'm not a Star Wars expert. I mean, and I seriously was interested in the first trilogy, but everything after that, with a few exceptions, was garbage. All right, but get back to the point. Like he put himself in a position in the pod races, right, to put himself at great personal risk to win these races, to help these people that he hardly knew get off the planet to pursue their quest, right? That is a heroic deed right there, right? Kind of putting yourself potentially in a point of self-sacrifice, right, for others. After that, when he became a Jedi, he was highly regarded as somebody who was very effective, especially as a general in the battles. And let us not forget that if we were going to criticize the Empire for being oppressive, right, the Jedi were oftentimes neck and neck, right, out there leading the charge with stormtroopers, right, on the battlefield. They were not a peaceful group. They were inherently warriors, right? They were knights. They were the Jedi Knights, right? So we can't assume that there was an aspect of peace to them, right? They were very much a fighting force. As a general, let me get back to that point, right? He was recognized for his valor. There's a kind of an in-between point here that kind of, I think, bridges his life from Anakin Skywalker to Darth Vader, right? And that is that he was very much a tortured soul, right? He grew up as a slave, right? And he carried with him, clearly, like, from that, a lot of trauma. And, his mother was kidnapped and brutalized in the desert, right? And he was in love with Padme, and as a knight was forbidden from having partnerships, right? Was basically forced or told he had to take an oath of celibacy. And time again, we see Anakin choosing the path of love, right? Deep love.
Or lust.
Okay, again, that's an aspect where I think you have to go inside someone's head to really know what was going on. I am of the opinion that there was actual love there, so he dared to go against the Jedi Order for the sake of love, right? And as someone who was prophesized to be kind of a revolutionary figure in the galaxy, like, you have to wonder, like, was it that aspect of love that he brought back to an otherwise kind of pious order, an aspect of, like, what he delivered, right? And this goes so far, right, or we see this manifested, like, even as Darth Vader, right? His last acts as Darth Vader before his death were acts of love, right? Where he threw the Emperor into the reactor core and saved his son Luke from death, right? And that was an aspect of self-sacrifice right there. So this theme, I think, persists through his life, and because of that, I don't think we can completely separate Anakin and Darth Vader. Like, there was threads of him, and this is actually told in the storyline when we see at the very end, when Luke is back on Endor, and there's the big party with the Ewoks, and he takes a moment to himself, and he walks out in the dark, and he sees Yoda and Obi-Wan. And he sees his father, Anakin, there, but not as Darth Vader. He sees him as his earlier self, right? So that's telling us that throughout his life, like, Darth Vader kept that core of his early self, right? And then I'll say this is the last point of why I think Darth Vader deserves hero status, is that if there was a turning point in the story here, it was when the Emperor was killed. And as far as I can tell, I don't think there was anyone else in that storyline who had the power or the access to make that decision other than Darth Vader, right? And so he was essentially the force that turned the course of events, right? And led to the destruction of the Empire.
Okay, some valid points there. Well, the first I would say is, like you have said yourself, it's contestable. We can count the actions of Anakin towards him if he himself disavows that, right? So, but let's just acknowledge that. You may or may not be able to include the Anakin actions as part of the Darth Vader character, but okay, we'll keep that open. As a point to the throwing the Emperor into the reactor core, shortly before that, the Emperor was actually making it very clear to Luke, hey, there's a Sith relationship has, the father and the son figure, right? The lead and the secondary. So he's basically in front of Darth saying, like, hey, we got to get rid of this Darth guy. You're the new Darth. So one could argue it was actually an act of self-preservation, that he saw the writing on the wall. The Emperor wanted to turn Luke to be his Sith, which meant, therefore, Darth had to die. So in a sense, it could have just been doing it for entirely selfish reasons. As far as the issue of choosing love, and it's really, this I think actually is a more interesting ethical quandary, and it goes back to debates between, like, sort of ancient Confucian philosophy and, like, the ancient Greek Western tradition. And that's about, like, do you give more, like, is the more ethical action to always put family first, or is the more ethical action, like, universal principles of justice, right? And so, like, a classic case is given that if you look at something like, let's say your father is committing crimes, he's embezzling or something like that. Like, in the Confucian tradition, you don't dishonor your father by turning him in, right? You find a way to, like, either through harmonious consensus, get the charges dropped or change his ways, but, like, you don't turn him over to the authorities in that tradition. Whereas in the Western tradition, it's more like, oh no, that's wrong. It's wrong to actually not turn your father in if you know he's committing crimes, right?
I don't know that that's true throughout our Western tradition. I know that in Germany, for example, given that I have, I work there fairly frequently and talk to my German colleagues about diverse things, there are strong laws that protect families in the legal system from testifying against each other. And so that's built in.
No, yeah, I guess I mean more the philosophical tradition is this idea that, like, if you're committed to universal justice, whether it's your father who commits a crime or a stranger, you should treat them as equal, like, equal before the law in terms of your, the importance of finding them guilty for the crimes, right? And so what the point I'm trying to make is I think whether or not you can see him choosing love over these other principles of justice is like which ethical sort of framework are you drawing upon, right? And so in this case, I think you could make the argument those who choose family over other broader principles of justice, such as like enabling the empire and taking over the world, that would be part of the argument there. But I think really what it comes to, I think the Jedi were sort of imagined sort of as a Buddhist kind of entity, right? This sort of like balance of the Force. And I suppose one of the reasons, well, in general, religious orders that have forced celibacy on their protectors, I don't think have a particularly good historical record. But I think the argument is the idea that, like, it's attachment, like love leads to an attachment and therefore takes you from clear thinking. So I think the argument to protect the Jedi from engaging in those kind of relationships is that kind of like loving attachment will make it harder for you to kind of like be a more dispassionate dispenser of justice and evaluating justice. But as far as him also, I would say another ethical component is, I mean, he was doing his actions on behalf of an empire, which, as being more anarchy inclined, I would be clearly opposed to. But the extent to which he was willing to buck authority itself, I think is a positive thing, and could be. And in fact, I often try to tell my students who they might have some students significantly misbehaving in class. I'm telling them, like, hey, don't automatically dismiss their value, because like as states head towards authoritarianism, and like those children that have a natural anti-authority streak, they might be the bulwarks against authoritarianism. So the extent to which a character has other principles besides just following orders as their mandate could be argued under the heroic elm.
And that's a very interesting aspect of this kind of unraveling this problem around the Jedi Order, right? If you want to accept that they had prophesized his coming and that he was going to be the person that would restore balance to the Force, in essence, it seems to me that they also therefore prophesized their own doom, right? That he was going to be this chaos factor and this disruptor. And maybe kind of what was needed was kind of a reset on the whole structure.
And that actually exists in a lot of mythologies, like Loki. Like Loki, also part of the Marvels, but clearly part of the older Nordic tradition, is that kind of chaos agent. And a lot of mythologies have this understanding that, like, if you don't have a chaos agent in your system, you get this kind of sclerotic old guard of tradition that kind of everything stultifies, dynamism dies. And so, so in that sense, he could have been this sort of like agent of chaos that actually helps a more effective, long-lasting Jedi Order.
Yeah, that you need to go through a period of death for there to be a period of regeneration, something new.
Which, of course, it was also his own part of the reason why he gave into the Emperor's propaganda and was wooed by him, was he couldn't handle the death of his partner. So it kind of goes back all to this idea of like those who don't have a comfortable relationship with death and can't handle death and can't accept death are going to be very drawn towards dark, can be easily manipulated into dark impulses if you haven't dealt with death as a force in our lives, and death not automatically being negative, right? Like death is part of the life cycle, and it's important to have that kind of appreciation of its role in the life cycle. Because what would happen if nobody died? Well, then you'd have like horrible kings from old might still be in charge of things and ruling kingdoms because they didn't naturally expire.
I like that point, and I want to build off that, because I think that also shows a little bit of the rot that was in the Jedi Order. Right? This exposes some of the hypocrisy, right? It is completely acceptable for Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon to evade death by pursuing their ghost forms after death, right? Yeah. Like they evaded death, right? But when Darth Vader wants to do it to preserve the love of his life, it's wrong.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. Fair point.
Right? It's so I think he was exposing the flaws and the kind of the corrupt thinking that was in the Jedi Order itself. There's another aspect of this story which I know very little about, but it takes place and it kind of involves this this character Admiral Thrawn, I think his name is, which I've just recently learned a little bit about. But like that part of the reason, and there's an interesting philosophical point here. Part of the reason for there wanting to be a consolidation of power was that there was an awareness amongst some that on the outer rim of the galaxy, there was another alien species that was extremely powerful and kind of was just like awakening from its slumber. And they had incredible powers of mind control, much like the Jedis. And that they were a threat to possibly taking over the entire galaxy. And the only way to combat that force was to build something strong like the Empire that could turn its resources outward to fight that. And so something like the development of the Empire was, although it came with costs, was a necessary step in the long run for the survival of the free world, actually.
Oh, I'm actually not familiar with that, so maybe you are more knowledgeable of the Star Wars universe.
A little bit. But and I'm probably getting parts of that wrong, so you can correct me in the comments if I got that wrong.
Update us where we're wrong on this issue, but I think I guess the broader issue is obviously this is an exercise. We're just having fun with this and being hyperbolic and in some cases extreme. But I think the idea is like even the concept of hero probably isn't a good concept to have, and maybe neither villain, and because first of all your actions, they don't happen in a vacuum, right? You are the sum total of all the experience you've had, all the influences you have, right? So you bring with either the acts of heroism or villainy like a whole background of which you're not simply the only individual responsible. But therefore what it might be more useful, I think, is generally not calling people in the real world heroes or villains, but identifying heroic and villainous actions. And that way you don't kind of make any sort of essentialism that like, because I think what often happens with like people are disappointed when they find out their heroes are not just flawed, but sometimes like horrible, right? Like they were like committing sexual assault and things like that. And I think it's because you put people on pedestals to begin with that it makes it harder to see, or you don't want to see the flaws because you built this image. So maybe then rather than even say people are heroes or villains, it might be more used to be like, that's a heroic action, that's a villainous action, which basically allows you to acknowledge each when each occurs and to be openly praising of the action as a model to follow and not necessarily any kind of holistic nature to the person. So in that sense, even though it might have been self-interested for self-preservation, Darth Vader's throwing the Emperor in the core was a heroic action, right? Because he clearly saw he was able to tap into his inner Anakin to see the darkness there and throw away all that he gained from it and do the heroic action of challenging him and killing him. So
yeah. I think that's a good insight to bring into this conversation here. And, I think we were both kind of, as we were developing this concept, kind of ruminating upon the idea of like what makes someone a hero or what defines heroic actions. And I think throughout this, there's kind of a sense of self-sacrifice, right? Like when you look at Greta Thunberg, you see somebody who's willing to sacrifice a comfortable life or put herself at risk in various situations, right? And when I look at somebody like Elon Musk, very seriously, I mean, I think he has sacrificed a lot. Like he lives kind of an austere life in many ways. I'm sure he gets up to his shenanigans too, right? But there, I think throughout that, regardless of what you think about him, there's an aspect of sacrifice, right? That's not sufficient though, right? That might be a necessary condition, right? Yeah. You have to be willing to sacrifice something or some part of yourself. There's another important aspect here, which is that I think it can't be just sacrifice without a sense of moral conviction. You have to be doing it for a reason. Right. I think we could, well, there's many different philosophies of life. I think you could probably generally, most people would get behind the idea that you have to be doing it for more than just personal gain, right? Or your personal pleasure, right? That there has to be some connection to a larger moral compass of sorts. And then what that is, I think, is really hard to determine. And this, I think, brings me to my third point. Who you determine, who you call a hero or what things you identify as heroic deeds is extremely relevant on your perspective. And that changes depending on what side of the line you're on or what time in history you're looking back upon.
Right. I think, for example, there's many ways you can say the kamikaze pilots in World War II Japan were heroic, but clearly they're throwing away their individual life. Sacrifice for the empire. So but on the other hand, the empire was absolutely monstrous, right? It was. Well, I mean,
they were certainly heroic from the perspective of the Japanese empire, right? For if you were a U.S. Midshipman on a battleship, right, and you got hit by a kamikaze pilot, I don't think there would be, you or your surviving shipmates probably wouldn't think that there was much greatness in that. I mean, I think you would still have to admire the aspect of self-sacrifice, right?
I guess then that brings a broader question of is a hero always going to be contextual? Like, can you actually find a hero that is decontextualized where all parties can agree based on their moral conviction and their actions that is a heroic action? Or is it always going to be contextual to the particular goals you agree or disagree with, the particular values you have? And I think, it's kind of an open question.
Yeah. I mean, in that sense, given that there's always another side to it, I think one conclusion is that there are no heroes, there's only villains.
Oh, and so elaborate a little bit, meaning...
I guess it's this, is if having somebody recognized as a universal hero requires complete consensus, there will never be complete consensus on this, right? But I think kind of the inverse of that might be true, is that to call someone a villain, you don't need complete consensus. You need one dissenting vote to say that that person's a horrible, terrible person. And I'm being a little bit hyperbolic now, kind of commenting on the state of our world and the state of political discourse, right? And so I really don't mean this in all seriousness, but I think it is easier to at this point advance people in the world as villains than it is to advance them as heroes.
Yeah, and I think, and especially based on, it's easy often to take a single act of villainy and attribute to that person whole villainous status, right? And although I will say, I guess you could say the heroes the same way, right? Like a person who saves a dog from a burning house, like that person, the media doesn't say that person engaged in a heroic action. They say that person is a hero, like a sum total hero. And I think that really that gets to it is this, I think we should avoid using either term based on an action. If you are going to use them, you want to have a really long track record, and you've looked at the sum total of all they've done, all they've protected, and then maybe, and even then I put a conditional maybe if you can actually use those terms. But before using those terms, you need to be sure you're not evaluating them on a single action.
Yeah. Very interesting. Well,
we had planned on a third segment, which was we'll just explain the hypothetical because we hope to do this in a future episode. But we're already way over on our expected time. We were going to imagine in a hypothetical world where the world is split between dictatorships and anarchy.
Importantly, in this scenario, this is a post-apocalyptic world. So we're imagining something, maybe not in the far future, but in our future that we haven't yet realized. Right? The world has kind of crashed and burned, and chaos has ensued, and you have a choice.
You can either rebuild yourself in small communities without any centralized government, or you can opt into an existing centralized structure. And so in a future... Dictatorship, yeah. So so obviously you would like to have a happy middle world of a peaceful democratic representation, but in this hypothetical, imagine you do not have that option. You had to choose either extreme. Which of the extreme you would be most comfortable with? And this.
So if you had to migrate, right, you could either travel west to the land of anarchy, or you could travel east to the land of the dictatorship. Which way would you go?
And that will be a topic we will explore in a future episode. Thank you all for joining our first edition of Heroes and Villains. May there be many more.
If you listened all the way to the end, or you enjoyed this, I think it would be really interesting to see your thoughts in the comments. Like, who of the four characters we identified here, Greta Thunberg, Elon Musk, Thanos, and Darth Vader, do you consider a hero and a villain?
And also, if this is a popular segment, feel free to suggest other people you would like evaluated as heroes and villains for future episodes.
Indeed. Looking forward to it. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you all, Eric. Pleasure as always.
Round 2, fight.
I am inevitable. Join Dark Side.